$85 for that? Get out of here, kid. Go pick up cans or something.
200 people watched. Nobody moved.
85. That's my bid.
Wade stepped closer, didn't whisper, wanted everyone to hear.
Your granddaddy spent his whole life picking through other people's trash. And here you are. Same thing. Like skin, like fate. Some things don't change, boy.
Scattered laughter, a few nods. Byron looked him dead in the eyes. Quiet, steady. 5 words nobody expected.
You're gonna regret this.
What Byron Owens pulled out of that burnt safe 24 hours later made national news. And Wade Prescott? He never showed his face at an auction again. But we'll get to that. 6 weeks before that moment, the Caldwell mansion burned. Nobody knew how it started. The fire marshal said faulty wiring. The neighbors said God finally got around to it. Either way, by the time the trucks arrived, the east wing was gone. The roof had caved in. 3 generations of wealth, timber, cotton, oil, sat under a blanket of ash and insurance paperwork. The county ordered a full estate liquidation. Everything that survived the fire would be auctioned off on the front lawn, first Saturday of November. The notice ran in the Meridian Star for 2 weeks straight. By the time auction day came, half the antique dealers in the Deep South had circled the date. By 7 that morning, Route 19 was lined with pickup trucks. Dealers from Jackson, Birmingham, and as far as Memphis rolled in with empty flatbeds and full wallets. Estate sales were blood sport in this part of Mississippi. The bigger the family, the bigger the haul. And the Caldwells were the biggest name Meridian had ever produced. Glenn Hargrove set up his podium on the porch at 8 sharp. 40 years in the auction business. Pressed khakis, reading glasses on a chain. The kind of voice that could sell sand to a man drowning in a desert. He didn't need a microphone. Never had. "Ladies and gentlemen," Glenn called out, tapping the podium twice. "Full liquidation. Everything sells as is, where is. No returns, no refunds. Let's get moving." The crowd pressed forward. Close to 200 people. Antique dealers stood in the first row, paddles ready. Behind them, the weekend flippers, the ones who hunted yard sales and flea markets for anything they could double. Behind them, the locals, arms crossed, watching, whispering about how the mighty Caldwells had finally come down to earth. The first lots moved fast. A set of Victorian dining chairs, $1,200 in 90 seconds. A walnut writing desk, $850. A pair of oil paintings in gilded frames, $2,000 flat. Brass fireplace tools, crystal decanters, a grandfather clock with a cracked face but a movement that still ticked. The dealers bid like machines. No emotion, no hesitation, just numbers and nods and the sharp crack of Glenn's gavel. Byron Owens watched from the back. He had walked here. 2 miles from the studio apartment on 8th Street where he'd been living since sophomore year. 21 years old. Senior at Meridian State, history major, dean's list 3 semesters running. None of that was visible. What was visible? A faded gray t-shirt washed until the collar sagged. Jeans with a permanent crease at the knee. Sneakers that had been white once. An olive backpack with one strap held together by duct tape. He stood near the property line where the mowed lawn turned to wild honeysuckle. A woman in a straw hat looked back at him, leaned toward her husband, whispered something. The husband glanced, shrugged, turned away. A dealer in the second row clocked him too, let his eyes linger, then went back to his catalog. The math was obvious to everyone. A young black man at a white money estate auction with no truck, no trailer, and no bidding paddle. The crowd had already done its calculation. The answer was irrelevant. Byron didn't care about the math. He cared about something else entirely. His right hand sat in his pocket, fingers curled around a folded envelope. 4 20s, 1 5. $85. Every dollar he owned. His grandfather's money. The last thing Earl Owens ever left him besides a set of locksmith tools and a head full of knowledge that nobody in this crowd had ever bothered to learn. Lot after lot moved through Glenn's hands. The morning wore on. The sun climbed. The crowd thinned slightly as the big-ticket items disappeared and the remaining lots grew smaller, dirtier, less interesting. Then 2 workers wheeled something out from behind the porch. It was black. Not painted black, burned black. A squat, heavy rectangle of steel, roughly 3 feet tall, coated in soot and carbon. One corner was dented. The handle was warped. Whatever markings had once been on its face were buried under 6 weeks of char and neglect. A safe, or what was left of one. Glenn looked at it, looked at his clipboard, and almost smiled. Lot number 73. 1 fire-damaged steel safe. Origin unknown. Combination unknown. Contents, if any, unknown. We'll start the bidding at $50. Silence. Not a single paddle moved. Glenn let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10. $50, folks, for a genuine steel safe. Somebody? Anybody? He swept his hand across the crowd like a game show host running out of contestants. Come on now! You could use it as a boat anchor if nothing else.
A few chuckles.
No paddles. 40? 30? Glenn's voice dropped the showmanship. Now he just sounded tired. I'll take $20. $20 for lot 73. Who wants to take this thing off my hands? Nothing. The dealers stared at their catalogs. The flippers studied their phones. The safe sat on the dolly like a headstone nobody wanted to claim. Glenn sighed and reached for his clipboard. All right, if there are no $85, the voice came from the back. Quiet, but clear. Every head in the first 3 rows turned at once. Byron Owens stepped forward. His hand was raised. Not a paddle, just his hand, open palm, fingers steady. Glenn blinked. I'm sorry, did you say 85? Yes, sir. $85. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not the excited kind, the confused kind. The kind that happens when something breaks the pattern and nobody knows whether to laugh or stare. Wade Prescott decided for them. He was standing in the second row, 45 years old. Tan blazer over a blue Oxford. Silver watch. The kind of man who shook your hand too hard and held it too long. Wade owned Prescott Antiques and Estate Services, the largest dealer operation between Jackson and Mobile. He had already spent $14,000 that morning. He was having a good day. Until now. Wade turned around slowly, looked Byron up and down, sneakers, jeans, backpack, skin, and let out a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. $85. Wade repeated it like he was tasting something sour. For that, he pointed at the safe, then back at Byron. Boy, do you even know what an auction is? Or did you wander in here looking for the Salvation Army? Laughter, loud, from at least 30 people. Byron didn't move. 85, that's my bid. Wade shook his head, still grinning. Glenn, come on. Are we really doing this? Kid probably found that money in a parking lot. More laughter. Glenn shifted behind his podium, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The gavel sat in his hand like a question he didn't want to answer. Wade wasn't done. He stepped out of his row and walked toward Byron. Not fast, slow. The way a man walks when he knows every eye in the room is on him and he likes it. Let me explain something to you, Wade said, loud enough for the last row to hear. That safe is a 200-pound piece of junk. No combination, no key, probably nothing inside but smoke and rat droppings. You're about to blow your whole paycheck, assuming you even have a paycheck, on something my guys wouldn't load onto a truck for free. He stopped 3 feet from Byron, close enough to see the frayed strap on his backpack, close enough to smell the mourning still on him. Your granddaddy spent his whole life picking through other people's trash, Wade said. And here you are, same blood, same hands, same dead-end story. Like skin, like fate, kid. Some things just don't change. The crowd didn't laugh this time. A few looked away. Most didn't. Byron held Wade's stare. Didn't step back. Didn't look down. His jaw was set, but his eyes were calm. The kind of calm that comes from having heard every version of this speech before. From teachers, from shop owners, from strangers on the street who saw the color first and never bothered to look past it. "You done?" Byron said. Wade smirked. "Yeah, I'm done. Question is, are you?" Byron turned to Glenn. $85, lot 73. Is that a valid bid or not?" Glenn cleared his throat. The crowd was silent now, not the respectful kind, the waiting kind. The kind that watches a car skid on ice and holds its breath to see if it flips. $85, Glenn said slowly. "Going once." Nobody moved. "Going twice." Wade crossed his arms and shook his head, the kind of slow, theatrical shake that said, "Let the fool have his trash." The gavel cracked. "Sold. Lot 73. $85 to the young man in the back." A smattering of applause. The mocking kind. Someone whistled. Someone else muttered something about a sucker born every minute. Byron walked to the front. He pulled the envelope from his pocket, counted out the bills, 4 20s, 1 5, and laid them on the table. Every cent flat and smooth, like they'd been pressed under a book. Glenn took the money without looking at him. Byron bent down, gripped the safe by its warped handle and its dented base, and lifted. 200 pounds of burnt steel. His arms shook, his knees locked, but he didn't ask for help, not from Glenn, not from the crowd, and certainly not from Wade Prescott, who stood 6 feet away, arms still crossed, still wearing that smirk like a badge. Byron carried the safe across the lawn, past the rows of folding chairs, past the pickup trucks, past the woman in the straw hat who watched him go with something that might have been pity or might have been shame. He didn't look back, not once. Earl Owens never called himself an expert. He called himself a listener. "Every lock talks," he used to say, holding a tumbler up to the light in his workshop on Cedar Lane. Most people just never shut up long enough to hear it. The workshop was a converted garage behind a shotgun house on the south side of Meridian. No sign out front, no website, no advertising, just a hand-painted piece of plywood nailed to the mailbox post that read, "Owens Locksmith. Keys cut, locks fixed, safes opened." The paint had faded years ago, but the people who needed Earl knew where to find him. Byron had spent every summer of his life in that garage. From the time he was 6 years old, he sat on an overturned milk crate beside his grandfather's workbench, watching Earl's hands move through steel and brass with a patience that bordered on reverence. Earl never rushed. He never forced a lock. He never drilled unless there was absolutely no other way. "Drilling is admitting you lost the conversation," he'd say. "I don't lose conversations." By the time Byron was 12, he could identify 40 different lock mechanisms by sight. By 14, he could pick a standard pin tumbler in under 3 minutes. By 16, Earl started teaching him safes. That was different. Safes were a different language entirely. Earl had a collection of manufacturer catalogs that filled 2 entire shelves along the back wall of the workshop. Mosler, Diebold, York, Sargent and Greenleaf, and his favorite, Herring Hall Marvin. He spoke about Herring Hall Marvin the way other men spoke about first loves. "Built between 1880 and 1910, Earl would say, running his finger across a yellowed catalog page. "Fireproof, bomb-proof, damn near time-proof. The company folded in 1959, but the safes are still out there. In basements, in barns, in old estates where nobody remembers what's inside anymore. And most of them were never emptied." He taught Byron how to identify them. The distinctive riveting pattern along the doorframe. The weight distribution, heavier toward the bottom because of the fire-resistant concrete lining. The serial numbers stamped on the inner lip of the hinge, always starting with a letter followed by 4 digits. The sound they made when you knocked on the side panel, a low, dense thud, unlike anything modern manufacturers could replicate. "Most people see a rusty box," Earl said once. "You and me, we see a time capsule." Byron absorbed everything, not because he had to, because Earl was the only person in his life who had ever treated him like he was worth teaching. Byron's mother had left when he was 3, moved to Atlanta, then Chicago, then somewhere nobody kept track of anymore. His father was a name on a birth certificate and nothing else. Earl was the whole family, the whole world, really. They lived simply. Earl's locksmith income covered the mortgage, the groceries, and Byron's school supplies. There was never extra, but there was never nothing either. Earl made sure of that. Every birthday, Byron got a new tool for his kit. Not a toy, a real tool. A tension wrench at 7, a rake pick at 9, a stethoscope, the medical kind, modified with a contact microphone, at 13. "You're building a vocabulary," Earl told him. "One day you're going to walk into a room and you're going to see something everyone else missed. And when that day comes, you'll be ready, because you listened." Byron believed him. Even when the kids at school didn't. Even when his teachers looked at his address and his clothes and his free lunch card and made their assumptions. Even when a guidance counselor in 10th grade told him he should consider a trade instead of college, not knowing that the trade his grandfather had already given him was worth more than any degree on the wall. Earl got sick in January. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor gave him 3 months. He lasted 2. He spent his last 2 weeks in the house on Cedar Lane, in the bedroom at the end of the hall, with the window cracked open so he could hear the mockingbirds in the pecan tree out back. The workshop stayed locked. Earl didn't have the strength to walk there anymore, and Byron couldn't bring himself to go alone. Byron sat with him every day after class. Read to him sometimes. Mostly just sat. They didn't talk much toward the end. Earl's voice was down to a rasp, then a whisper, then just breathing. But on the last night, he grabbed Byron's wrist with a grip that surprised them both. A dying man's grip, sudden and fierce. "The envelope," Earl whispered. "Top drawer. Workbench." He was gone by morning. Byron found it the next day. A plain white envelope sealed, with his name written across the front in Earl's careful block letters. Inside, $85 in cash, 4 20s, 1 5, and a note on a torn piece of notebook paper. "You'll know what it's for when you see it. Trust your ears. Pop." Byron didn't understand. Not then. He put the envelope in his backpack and carried it with him every day for 6 months. Through the funeral, where 11 people came. Through the emptying of the house, where he kept only the tools and the catalogs. Through the start of his senior year at Meridian State, where nobody knew and nobody asked. He carried it like a question he couldn't answer yet, until the morning he saw the notice in the Meridian Star. Estate liquidation, Caldwell Mansion, full inventory. And there, buried in the fine print of lot descriptions, 4 words that stopped his breath. 1 fire-damaged safe. Byron read the description 3 times. Then he went to his backpack, pulled out the envelope, and held it in both hands. He didn't know what was inside that safe. He didn't know if anything was inside at all. But he knew the safe itself. He knew it the way Earl had taught him to know things. Not from the outside, but from the bones, from the weight, from the sound, from the history that lived in the metal. $85. Exactly enough for a junk lot that nobody else would want. He could almost hear Earl laughing. Byron borrowed a truck. It belonged to Terrence Gaines, the only friend he had at Meridian State who owned something with 4 wheels and a working tailgate. Terrence didn't ask questions. He just pulled up to the Caldwell property at noon, helped Byron wrestle the safe onto the bed of his 2004 Chevy Silverado, and drove them both back to Byron's apartment without saying much of anything. "You good?" Terrence asked when they'd unloaded the safe onto the kitchen floor. The linoleum groaned under the weight. "I'm good. You need anything else?" "No, thanks, T." Terrence looked at the safe, looked at Byron, looked at the safe again. He opened his mouth, thought better of it, and left. The apartment was a studio. 1 room, 1 window, 1 bathroom with a shower that took 4 minutes to get warm. The kitchen was a strip of counter with a microwave and a 2-burner stove. Byron's bed was a mattress on the floor. His desk was a folding table from Walmart. His bookshelf was 3 milk crates stacked against the wall, filled with history textbooks and Earl's manufacturer catalogs. The safe sat in the middle of the kitchen floor like a black altar. 210 pounds of burnt steel, soot, and silence. Byron locked the front door, drew the blinds, pulled Earl's toolbox from under his bed, a dented metal case with a brass clasp that still worked perfectly, and set it on the counter. Then he sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the safe and just looked at it. For a long time, he just looked. The exterior was a disaster. The fire had done its work thoroughly. The original paint, probably black or dark green, was gone, replaced by a mottled layer of carbon and oxidized steel. The handle on the front was warped slightly to the left. The hinges on the right side were blackened but intact. The combination dial was frozen in place, fused by heat into a position somewhere between 30 and 35. None of that mattered. Not yet. Byron reached into the toolbox and pulled out a soft, bristle brush. He started at the top left corner of the safe and worked his way across, brushing away ash and soot with the careful strokes of an archaeologist clearing dirt from bone. Layer by layer, the surface beneath began to reveal itself. Dark steel, pitted and scarred but solid. 20 minutes in, he found the first marking, a shallow groove along the top edge of the door frame. He ran his thumb across it, then again slower. A pattern. Evenly spaced rivets, each one slightly recessed, each one the same diameter. He counted them, 14, spaced exactly 3/4 of an inch apart. His pulse quickened. He knew that spacing. He moved to the lower right corner of the door, brushed harder. More carbon fell away in gray sheets, and there, stamped into the steel in letters barely a 1/4 inch tall, he found what he was looking for. HHM. 3 letters. Herring Hall Marvin. Byron sat back on his heels. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, not from fatigue, from recognition. He closed his eyes and heard Earl's voice, clear as a summer morning. The company folded in 1959, but the safes are still out there. He wasn't done. He needed more. He needed the model number, the patent year, the serial code. He needed to know exactly what generation he was dealing with, exactly which locking mechanism sat behind that frozen dial. He moved to the hinge side, found the inner lip, the narrow strip of steel visible between the door edge and the frame. Except this door wasn't ajar. It was sealed, locked. The fire had welded nothing. The lock mechanism had simply done its job. The safe was closed because it was designed to stay closed. That was the whole point. Byron pulled out a penlight and angled it along the gap between the door and the frame. There, stamped vertically along the inner lip, half hidden by a century of grime and 6 weeks of fire residue, Patent 1891, number 3120, Series E. He grabbed Earl's catalog, the thick one, the one with the cracked leather spine that smelled like pipe tobacco and machine oil, and flipped to the Herring Hall Marvin section. Page after page of illustrations, specifications, patent numbers. His finger traced down the columns until it stopped. Series E, Patent 1891. Fire-resistant vault, double-wall construction, concrete and asbestite lining. Rated for sustained temperatures up to 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,700 degrees. The Caldwell house fire had burned hot, but not that hot. No residential fire burned that hot. The exterior had taken the damage. The shell had charred and warped and blistered. But the interior, the cavity where the contents lived, was protected by 2 inches of fireproof lining that had been engineered over a century ago to survive exactly this kind of catastrophe. The engineers who built this safe were long dead, but their work was still holding. Byron knocked on the side panel with his knuckle. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound came back low and dense, a solid thud with almost no resonance. Not hollow, not empty. There was mass behind that wall, weight that wasn't just steel and concrete. Something was sitting on the other side of that door, sealed in darkness for God knows how long, waiting for someone to come along and listen. He pulled out his phone and called Professor Edith Calloway. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Professor, it's Byron. Byron Owens." "Byron, it's Saturday." I know, I'm sorry. I need to tell you something. He told her. The auction, the safe, the HHM stamp, the patent number, the Series E catalog match. He spoke fast, the words tripping over each other like they couldn't get out of his mouth quickly enough. There was a long pause on the other end. Byron, Calloway said carefully, if what you're telling me is accurate, and that is a significant if, you may be sitting in front of a sealed time capsule from the 1890s. I know. Do not drill it. Do not pry it. Do not try to force it open. Do you understand me? I wasn't going to. Another pause, longer this time. How exactly do you plan to open it? Byron looked at Earl's toolbox, at the stethoscope with the contact microphone, at the tension wrenches lined up by size, at the notebook where Earl had written in his careful block letters the default combination sequences for every Herring Hall Marvin model manufactured between 1880 and 1910. The same way my grandfather taught me, Byron said. I'm going to listen. He started at 9 that evening. The apartment was quiet. The window was closed. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling into its bones. Byron had turned off his phone, shut his laptop, cleared everything off the kitchen floor except the safe, the toolbox, and himself. He filled a glass of water and set it beside him. He wouldn't touch it for 2 hours. He opened Earl's notebook to the Herring Hall Marvin section. Page 47. The entry for Series E, patent 1891, was written in Earl's precise block letters, each one the same height, each one perfectly spaced. Earl had documented 12 possible default combinations for this model, factory presets that manufacturers used before the buyer could set their own code. Most owners never changed them, especially in the 1890s when the safe itself was considered security enough. But there was a problem. The combination dial was fused. Heat had welded it to the faceplate at roughly the 32 mark. It wouldn't turn. Not left, not right, not with fingers and not with pliers. The dial was dead, which meant Byron couldn't use it. The conventional path was sealed. He sat back and thought. Earl had trained him for this, not this exact scenario, but the principle behind it. When the front door is locked, Earl used to say, leaning back on his stool with a pick in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, you don't break it down. You find the side door. There's always a side door. The side door, in safe-cracking terms, was the relocker bypass. Every Herring Hall Marvin Series E had a secondary access point. A small, spring-loaded relocker bolt hidden behind the dial mechanism, designed to jam the lock permanently if someone tried to drill through the face. It was a security feature, a trapdoor for thieves. But the relocker itself had a weakness, a hairline gap in the bolt housing that could be reached through the hinge side of the door, if you knew exactly where to look and exactly how deep to go. Earl had taught him this on a Saturday afternoon when Byron was 17. They'd practiced on a decommissioned Mosler that Earl kept in the back of the workshop specifically for training. Every safe has an ego, Earl had said, watching Byron probe the hinge gap with a tension wrench. It thinks it's smarter than you. Your job is to be patient enough to prove it wrong. Byron pulled the contact microphone from the toolbox. It was a simple device, a medical stethoscope with the chest piece replaced by a flat brass disc that could be pressed against a metal surface to amplify internal vibrations. Earl had built it himself from parts he'd ordered out of a medical supply catalog 20 years ago. The rubber tubing was cracked in 2 places, repaired with electrical tape that had been rewrapped at least 3 times. It still worked perfectly. He pressed the disc against the hinge side of the safe, about 4 inches below the top hinge. Then he closed his eyes and listened. Metal has a voice. Most people don't know that. But metal speaks in vibrations, in frequencies, in the tiny shifts of pressure that happen when internal components move against each other. A trained ear, one that has spent years learning the language, can hear the difference between a locked bolt and an unlocked one, between a spring under tension and a spring at rest, between a mechanism that's intact and one that's been compromised by heat or time or both. For the first 40 minutes, Byron heard nothing useful. The steel was thick. The fireproof lining absorbed most of the vibration, swallowing sound the way sand swallows water. He shifted the disc a quarter-inch down, then another quarter-inch, then another, moving methodically along the hinge side, mapping the interior by sound the way a bat maps a cave in total darkness. Sweat gathered along his hairline. His knees ached against the hard floor. He ignored both. At the 53-minute mark, he found it. A faint click. Not a mechanical click, a resonance shift. The sound changed from a flat, dead thud to something slightly brighter, slightly more alive. There was a cavity behind the steel at that exact point. An air gap. The relocker bolt housing. Byron marked the spot with a piece of chalk. Then he selected a tension wrench from the toolbox, the thinnest one Earl owned, a custom-ground piece of spring steel no wider than a sewing needle. He inserted it into the hairline gap along the hinge seam, angling it toward the chalk mark. His hands were steady, his breathing was slow. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips, and he waited until it settled before he pushed the wrench deeper. 1 inch. 2 inches. The wrench met resistance. A spring. The relocker spring. He applied pressure, gentle, constant, the way Earl had taught him, not a push, but a lean. Like convincing the mechanism rather than forcing it, like asking permission. Nothing happened. He adjusted the angle by 2 degrees, applied pressure again. Nothing. He pulled the wrench out, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, sat still for a full minute, breathing, thinking, listening to the silence of his own apartment like it owed him an answer. Then he remembered something Earl had said about Series E models, something about the spring tension being reversed on units manufactured after 1889. A design change that most locksmiths never learned about because the documentation was buried in a patent amendment that nobody read. They flipped the orientation, Earl had told him. Counterintuitive. You push where you'd expect to pull. The engineers did it on purpose. One more layer of protection against brute force. Byron reinserted the wrench. This time, instead of pressing inward, he applied lateral pressure, sideways toward the front of the safe, against every instinct he had. The spring gave. A soft, metallic snap echoed inside the safe. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small sound like a finger snap heard through a wall. But Byron felt it through the wrench, through his fingers, through his wrist, all the way up to his shoulder. The relocker bolt had released. Now the main lock was exposed. Without the relocker jamming the mechanism, the primary bolt assembly could be manipulated directly through the hinge gap. Byron switched to a longer tension wrench and a hook pick. He inserted both, working by feel and by sound, adjusting pressure in increments so small they couldn't be measured, only felt. The tumblers began to move, one by one. Each one announced itself with a subtle click that only the contact microphone could catch. First tumbler, a soft tap, like a raindrop hitting a tin roof. Second tumbler, slightly higher pitch. Third, deeper, more certain. 41 minutes later, the fourth and final tumbler fell into place. The bolt retracted with a sound like a sigh, like the safe was exhaling for the first time in over a century. Byron pulled the door. It didn't move. He pulled harder. The hinges, blackened and stiff from the fire, resisted like arthritic joints. He braced his feet against the floor, gripped the warped handle with both hands, and pulled with everything he had. The door swung open. A breath of stale, sealed air hit his face. Cool, dry, untouched. The air inside that safe hadn't been disturbed since... when? The 1920s? Earlier? It smelled like old paper and iron and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers pressed between book pages a lifetime ago. Byron reached for his penlight and aimed it into the cavity. The interior was immaculate. No smoke, no ash, no water damage. The fireproof lining had done exactly what it was built to do more than a century ago. The walls of the cavity were clean, dry, and perfectly intact. And there, sitting on the bottom shelf of the safe, was a tin box, dark green, rectangular, about the size of a shoebox. sealed with a simple brass latch. Next to it, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had yellowed with age but held its shape, was a leather-bound journal. Byron's hands trembled as he reached inside. He lifted the tin box out first. It was heavier than he expected. Something shifted inside, not loose but layered, like pages stacked on top of each other, pressed flat by time and weight. He set the box on the kitchen floor. Then he reached back in and carefully withdrew the journal. The leather was dry but intact. The binding creaked softly when he held it, like an old door opening for the first time in decades. He sat on the floor of his studio apartment. A burnt safe open in front of him. A tin box in one hand. A century-old journal in the other. $85 poorer than he'd been that morning. He opened the tin box, and everything changed. Inside the tin box, arranged in neat rows and separated by sheets of wax paper that had yellowed but held their shape, were stamps. Not ordinary stamps, not the kind you'd find in a child's collection binder from a hobby shop. These were mounted on acid-free cardstock, each one protected by a glassine envelope, each one labeled in handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been done under a magnifying glass. The work of someone who understood that what they were preserving was worth more than the paper it was printed on. Byron counted them. 43 stamps in total. Most were 19th century U.S. postage, rare enough on their own to make a collector's hands sweat. A few were foreign: British Empire, early German Confederation, pre-Revolution France. But it was the stamp in the bottom left corner of the collection that stopped Byron's hands and stopped his breathing. A 24-cent airmail stamp, red and blue, printed in 1918, and the biplane at the center, the Curtiss JN-4, was upside down, an inverted Jenny. Byron had seen photographs of it in textbooks. He had read about it in Earl's catalogs. He knew the story by heart. On May 10, 1918, a sheet of 100 stamps was printed with the airplane accidentally inverted. Only that one sheet made it into circulation before the error was caught. Of the original 100, fewer than 90 were known to survive. Each one was worth a fortune. And one of them was sitting in a tin box on his kitchen floor. He didn't touch it. He didn't dare. He set the tin box down with both hands, sat back against the cabinet, and pressed his palms against his face. His fingers were shaking. His eyes were burning. He sat like that for a long time. Then he opened the journal. The handwriting was different from the stamp labels. Larger, looser, written with a fountain pen that left thick downstrokes and thin upstrokes. The first page read, "Private Journal of Theodore Caldwell, Sr. Begun this 14th day of March, 1887. Byron turned the pages carefully, one at a time, holding each corner with the tips of his fingers. The journal spanned decades. Theodore Caldwell had documented his life, his business, his family, and, buried between entries about cotton prices and property acquisitions, something else entirely. He had documented the people who built his empire. Names, dates, work records. Dozens of black laborers, field workers, carpenters, bricklayers, cooks, who had lived and worked on Caldwell land from the 1870s through the early 1900s. Men and women whose labor had generated the wealth that built the mansion, bought the land, funded the dynasty. Not one of them had ever appeared in any public record, any county archive, any history book. Until now. Byron read until 3 in the morning. Then he called Professor Calloway. She arrived at his apartment by 6, still in the clothes she'd been sleeping in, hair pulled back with a rubber band. She brought cotton gloves, a magnifying loupe, and a portable UV light. She didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. She just looked, turned pages, held the loupe over the inverted Jenny for so long that Byron thought she'd stopped breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Byron, do you understand what you have?" "I think so." "The stamps alone, if this inverted Jenny is authentic, we're talking somewhere between $500,000 and $1.6 million. At auction, possibly more depending on condition and provenance." She turned to the journal, held the UV light over the first page. The paper fluoresced exactly the way 19th century rag paper should, a soft, bluish glow that no modern forgery could replicate. "And this," she said, setting the light down gently, "is arguably more valuable than the stamps. This is primary source documentation of an entire community that was erased from the historical record. Names, dates, labor contributions. This is the kind of evidence that historians spend entire careers looking for and never find." The news traveled the way news travels in small towns, fast and crooked, through phone calls and gas station conversations and Sunday church whispers. By Monday morning, half of Meridian knew that the kid who bought the burnt safe had found something inside it. By Monday afternoon, the other half knew too. The Meridian Star ran a front-page story on Tuesday. By Wednesday, the Associated Press had picked it up. By Thursday, Byron's phone had 17 voicemails from journalists, 3 from auction houses, and 1 from the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and 1 from Wade Prescott. Wade showed up at Byron's apartment on Friday afternoon. He came alone. No blazer this time, no silver watch, just a polo shirt and a look on his face that sat somewhere between embarrassment and calculation. "I want to make you an offer," Wade said, standing in the doorway. He didn't step inside. Byron hadn't invited him. $5,000 for the stamp collection. All of it. Cash. Right now. Byron leaned against the doorframe. "The inverted Jenny alone is worth over $1 million. That's if it's real. And if it's not, you've got a box of old paper and a story nobody cares about in 6 months." Wade tried a smile. It didn't land. $5,000 is real money, Byron. Today. No waiting, no experts, no risk. Byron studied him. This was the same man who had called his grandfather a trash picker in front of 200 people. The same man who had told him that his skin was his fate. The same man who had laughed loudest and clapped hardest when the crowd decided that Byron Owens wasn't worth the air he was breathing. "No," Byron said. "Think about it." "I did. The answer is no." "And Wade?" Byron straightened up, looked him in the eyes the same way he had at the auction. Same calm, same quiet. "Don't come back here." Wade's jaw tightened. He stood there for a moment, searching for something to say that would give him the last word. He didn't find it. He turned and walked back to his truck. Didn't look over his shoulder. Didn't need to. They both knew who had won. 2 weeks later, a philatelist from the American Philatelic Society flew in from New York. He examined the inverted Jenny under laboratory conditions at Meridian State's Conservation Lab, with Professor Calloway and 2 graduate students observing. The verdict? Authentic. Position 49 from the original sheet. Condition, VF to XF. Estimated auction value, $1.2 million. The journal was authenticated separately by a team of historians from the University of Mississippi. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, all consistent with the 1880s through 1910s. The names in the journal were cross-referenced with census records, church registries, and burial documents. Every single one checked out. Theodore Caldwell Sr. had kept a record of the people his family had profited from and forgotten. And that record had survived, sealed in a fireproof safe, locked inside a burned mansion, purchased for $85 by a 21-year-old black man carrying a dead man's tools and a dead man's intuition. The journal was donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. A formal ceremony was held in the rotunda of the Old Capitol Museum in Jackson. The names of 47 black laborers were read aloud for the first time in over a century. Some of their descendants were in the audience. Some of them wept openly, hearing names they had only known from family stories whispered at kitchen tables. Some just stood, silent, listening to their great-grandparents' names spoken in a building where, 100 years ago, those same people would not have been allowed through the front door. Byron stood at the podium. He wore a suit that Professor Calloway had helped him pick out. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the historians, at the families who had driven from across the state to hear names that history had tried to erase, and said one sentence. My grandfather spent his whole life being called a junk man. Turns out he was the smartest man in this town. The room stood. The inverted Jenny sold at auction 4 months later. A private collector in Connecticut paid $1.35 million. After taxes, fees, and commission, Byron walked away with just under $900,000. He didn't buy a car. He didn't buy a house. He didn't move to a bigger city. The first thing he did was set up the Earl Owens Memorial Scholarship Fund. Full tuition for one black student per year at Meridian State, majoring in history or archival science. The only requirement beyond grades and financial need was a 500-word essay answering one question. Who taught you to see what others miss? The first recipient was a 19-year-old woman from Hattiesburg named Lena Brooks. She wrote about her mother, a school janitor who taught her to read by labeling every object in their apartment with index cards. Lena graduated 3 years later with honors. The second thing Byron did was reopen Earl's workshop on Cedar Lane, not as a locksmith shop, as a museum. 2 rooms and a workbench dedicated to the history of black craftsmanship in Mississippi. Earl's tools hung on the walls alongside photographs and reproductions from the Caldwell Journal. A hand-painted sign out front read, "The Earl Owens Center for Craft and Memory." On the wall behind the workbench, in a simple black frame, was Earl's note. "You'll know what it's for when you see it. Trust your ears. Pop." The center opened on a Saturday in April, the same month Earl had died. Byron stood in the doorway and watched people file in. Students, teachers, families, historians, and a few old-timers from the neighborhood who remembered Earl and his quiet way of fixing things other people had given up on. One visitor came alone. Late afternoon, when the crowd had thinned. He walked in without speaking, hands in his pockets, and stood in front of Earl's photograph near the entrance. Earl, in his workshop doorway, wrench in hand, half-smile, squinting against the afternoon sun. Wade Prescott stood there for a long time, didn't sign the guest book, didn't say a word to Byron, who watched from 12 feet away. He just looked at the man he'd called a trash picker. Then he turned and walked out. He never came to another auction in Meridian. The people who had laughed with him that Saturday morning didn't laugh with him the same way anymore. Some had seen the news. Some had seen the ceremony in Jackson. Some had just quietly started to feel the weight of what they'd been part of. Byron graduated that spring, summa cum laude. His thesis used the Caldwell Journal as primary source material for documenting undocumented black labor in post-Reconstruction Mississippi. It was published in the Mississippi Historical Review. He was accepted into the graduate program at Howard University, full scholarship. He moved in August, carrying 2 suitcases and Earl's toolbox. The toolbox sits on the shelf beside his desk now. He doesn't use it much anymore. But sometimes, late at night, when the work feels endless, he opens the brass clasp and looks inside. The tension wrenches, the hook picks, the contact microphone with the cracked tubing and the electrical tape Earl had rewrapped 3 times. And he remembers what it felt like to sit on a kitchen floor in Meridian, Mississippi, ear pressed against a burnt safe that everyone else had called trash. Listening, waiting, trusting that the thing nobody else could see was real. It was. If this story hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment. Tell me, what's the most valuable thing someone taught you that had nothing to do with money? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Stories like this don't come around twice.
$85, every cent Byron owned, and it unlocked what a 100-year-old mansion full of wealth never could. Here's what gets me. Wade Prescott looked at Byron and saw a broke kid buying junk. But Byron wasn't buying a safe. He was finishing a conversation his grandfather started 20 years ago. Earl Owens spent his whole life being dismissed, a junk man, a nobody, but that nobody built a language out of patents, taught his grandson to hear what still wouldn't tell anyone else. And that knowledge, passed down in a garage with no sign and no website, turned out to be worth more than every antique Wade Prescott and Salt. The world keeps underestimating quiet people, and quiet people keep providing the world wrong. So I want to ask you something, and I mean really think about it. What kind of brilliance are we walking past every day because it doesn't look in the way we expect? And the person you poured into you when nobody was watching, do they know what they built? Tell me in the comments. Who taught you to see what others missed? Like, subscribe, and share this. I'll see you in the next time.